Welcome to this training video for Circles of Support and Accountability. My name is Dr. Robin Wilson. This video was created in conjunction with the United States Department of Justice and is intended as a training video for people who are involved in Circles of Support and Accountability projects. However, we recognize that the information contained in this video may be helpful to other people who are interested in sexual violence prevention. So by all means, if you find something in this video helpful to you and you're not involved in a Circles project, feel free to use it. I should note that there is a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this that you may wish to obtain as well. It should be available on the US DOJ website as part of this Circles of Support and Accountability Circles of Support and Accountability project. However, if you can't find it there easily, you can go to my website, www.robinjwilson.com, and go to the Circles of Support and Accountability tab, and you should be able to find it there. Okay, where I'd like to start is I'd like to set the stage a bit by talking about some of the realities of sexual offending as a construct. The first thing we know is that the vast majority of people who engage in sexual violence are male. That's not to say that there aren't females who also engage in this sort of behavior, but they tend to be much more rare, and they tend to engage in the behavior for different reasons than their male counterparts. One of the other things we also know is that there are a lot of adolescent boys who engage in inappropriate sexuality. And the reasons for this are pretty simple. There are two things that are kind of working against boys. One is when they hit puberty, they get a huge onrush of the sex hormone testosterone, which causes their bodies to change, but it also causes them to have some very different thoughts about sexuality. Some things that their bodies do are perhaps strange and new and unique, and things that they haven't encountered before. So they have a lot of sexual energy caused by this large amount of testosterone coming into their bloodstream, which is, sort of triggering all of the body changes that happen for males in youth. But the other part of it is that their brains aren't quite developed yet, especially what we call the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain at the front of your forehead here. And that's the part of the brain that controls all of the higher order thinking, all the higher order problem solving skills and that sort of thing. And we know from recent research that that part of the brain doesn't finish developing until early to mid-20s. So if you think about it, boys who hit puberty, who have all of that sexual energy, unfortunately don't have a lot in the way of advanced problem solving. So they sometimes get themselves into trouble. And the way they get themselves into trouble is through sexual exploration, sometimes through experimenting with peers or with some younger children. Sometimes they engage in behaviors that get them in trouble. What we know is that the vast majority of boys who engage in sexually offensive conduct while they're youth tend not to engage in this behavior after they become adults. In fact, somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% or better of boys who engage in sexually offensive conduct as juveniles will not go on to sexually offend as adults. A point to make, though, however, amongst those people who have also sexually offended as adults, those of them who also sexually offended while they were juveniles, this tends to be a risk marker. So a couple of things to say here. One, boys who sexually offend while they are juveniles are unlikely to sexually reoffend as adults. However, those adults who have engaged in sexually offensive conduct and who also did so while they were juveniles tend to be somewhat higher risk because of that early onset. We know that most people who find themselves involved in crime probably didn't just happen upon it one day, or just decide, hey, I think I'll become a criminal. We know from some recent research that people who engage in crime have nearly 4 times as many what we call adverse childhood experiences as their counterparts who aren't involved in crime. When we talk about adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about things like broken families, experience of abuse as children, poor nutrition, poor educational opportunities, poor support, sort of early entry into drug and alcohol use. These are all the sorts of things that put kids at a disadvantage for becoming involved in crime. For us, in the circles of support and accountability world, and I may just call that CoSA from here on in, what this means is that many of the clients or many of the core members that we end up having in our circles have what we call complex needs, meaning that there's an awful lot of junk in their history that has really contributed a lot to the sort of people that they've grown to be. And some of that came from their experience in prison as well. So they have a lot working against them. It's why so many of them have a difficult time reintegrating when they come back to the community, and why some of the people who've engaged in sexual offending need a circle or need a CoSA, because that's really going to help them to do much better when they get back to the community. We know that most sexual offenders are unlikely to sexually reoffend. Certainly this is something that's going to be based on the level of risk, and those people who are at the higher end of the risk continuum clearly are more likely to reoffend than people at the lower end of the risk continuum. But as a group generally, we know that as many as 95% of people who sexually offend who are coming into the system are first time caught. What that means is that about 5% of those people coming into the system on a year-by-year basis are people who have been involved in a sexual offense previously. That's an interesting statistic because it suggests that the vast majority of sexual offenders don't engage in new sexually offensive conduct when they get back to the community. And this appears to be true. Reoffense rates are much lower than what most people would believe they are. Now, at this point, I think it's really important for us to be honest and to say that underreporting is a huge issue. We have yet to find a way to make it safe for victims to come forward and tell us about their experiences of having been abused. At this point, approximately 60 to 65% of people who have been sexually victimized don't tell anyone in a position of authority who could do something about that. So we always have to keep in mind, whenever we talk about, kind of statistics with respect to reoffending or offending, any of that sort of stuff, we always have to keep in mind that there's this factor of underreporting that has to be taken into consideration. When we look at the meta-analytic research, and some of this is a bit dated, so I'm going to report this because it's important, I think, because it's a large scale study. But more recent research has suggested that rates are even lower. So if we look at large scale research results from 2005, what we found was that as a group, people who engage in sexual violence will reoffend at a rate of about 15% over 5 to 7 years post-release. At this point, however, most states and the federal government here in the United States, and this would appear to be true in other countries like Canada and the United Kingdom and other, sort of similar nations, that rates of reoffending are about 10% over 10 years. That's not to say that people who have been involved in sexual violence don't get into trouble for other reasons. Certainly we know that many people will find themselves in trouble with their probation officer or while they're on parole for engaging in other rule-breaking behavior that gets them breached if you're in Canada or violated if you're in the United States. And we know that people who have been previously convicted of sexual offenses, once they are returned to the community, stand a much greater chance of being charged for engaging in some sort of violation than they do for actually engaging in a new sexual offense. Which again emphasizes that point I was making before about them having complex needs, meaning that they often have poor problem-solving skills, they may tend to be impulsive, they may engage in behaviors that are certainly poorly advised, and that may require some sort of some sort of assistance, and that's actually where a circle of support or a CoSA can really be quite helpful. Because we know that if we want people to go back to the community safely and not engage in any new offensive behavior, we're going to have to institute policy and practices that are going to address those complex needs. And I think that's where CoSA is really well situated to assist in this process. So, we're going to be talking about risk assessment this evening, or this day, whatever time it is for you. It's evening for me at the moment. And I suppose there are some important questions. Why do we bother to do this at all? Why do we assess risk? Well, the first answer here is a pretty easy one. We're interested in increasing public safety. The reason why I do what I do is because I believe that I help make society safer through the work that I do. For those of you who are thinking about volunteering in a circle, clearly that's something that's important to you as well. So we're in the public safety business. We're trying to make the world a safer place. We also need to determine who needs special services, or who are the sort of folks who are probably going to get by with just the sort of routine interventions that any person convicted of a sexual offense might receive once they are released to the community. We know, however, that in most places there's not enough treatment spaces, that caseloads for probation officers are often high. So we want to make sure that we separate the people that we're going to be supervising or treating into different levels of risk. We want to know who are the people who are below average risk, who are the average risk folks, and who are the folks who are at the higher end of that risk continuum. The research is really clear that we need to focus on those people who pose the greatest risk. This follows from a model known as the risk-need responsivity model. And I'll take just a couple of seconds to outline that for you. The risk principle says intervene at the level of risk that's posed by the individual. So people who are at the lower end of the risk continuum need a low level of intervention if they need anything at all. People who are in the middle require something that's more moderate. People who are at the higher end of the risk continuum, those are the people who require the intensive interventions. If you think of it this way, if you were working in your garden and you got a sliver in your finger, you'd probably go in the house, get your tweezers, pull it out, depending on whether or not there was any blood or anything. You might put something antiseptic on it just to guard off any chance of infection. Pretty low level problem, pretty low level intervention. If you were working in the garden and you got a big piece of wood stuck in the middle of your hand or something or other, something more substantial than a sliver, but something you could still pull out, you'd probably go in the house, you would pull it out, sort of have a look at it, determine whether or not you needed stitches or anything like that. If you did need stitches, you'd go to the walk-in clinic or to your local family practitioner, whoever, who would kind of sew it up, deal with whatever. So here you have a somewhat more serious sort of problem that requires a little bit more intervention. If you were working in the garden and you put a piece of wood through the middle of your hand so that it was stuck through the other side, well, you're probably going to go to the emergency room because that would be the most appropriate. Most appropriate intervention for that sort of issue. And then they would probably give it some sort of freezing while they pulled the piece of wood out. Then they would sew you up, and kind of depending on whether or not you did any damage to your hand, you might need surgery. So you can see a much more serious issue requires a much more serious intervention. If you went to the ER every time you got a sliver, they'd probably get tired of you, and they might ban you from showing up for such low-level things. At the same time, if you tried to deal with that piece of wood that was stuck through your hand at home, you're probably going to lose the use of your hand. It might get infected. There are all sorts of things that could go wrong. So the risk principle, pretty simple. Match the level of intervention to the level of risk that's posed by the individual. The need principle, equally simple. Figure out what the problem is and deal with it in a way that makes sense. So you probably don't want to go to see your psychiatrist to help you deal with the piece of wood in your hand, because he or she is not really trained to deal with that sort of thing. You need to go to the appropriate person who's going to appropriately deal with your issue. So you need to get the right sort of service for the problem that's being identified. So, for instance, a person who has some issues with respect to sexual violence may or may not need to go to AA. If they have some difficulties with alcohol, perhaps AA might make sense. But if you were to use AA as your primary intervention for someone who has issues with respect to sexual violence, you're not going to really be hitting the mark. The responsivity principle is the one that we often do poorly. This is the principle that says that notwithstanding whatever we know about risk and need, it's really important for us to also consider who it is that we're offering the service to. So if you have someone who has an intellectual disability, or someone who is illiterate, or someone who has a really difficult time with people in positions of power, these are all sorts of things that you might want to take into consideration when you're crafting the intervention, so that you make sure that you don't unintentionally create roadblocks to any potential success that the client might be able to actually achieve. So you want to take into consideration the individual's learning style, any other sort of personal barrier that they might have to change. You want to look at things like, for instance, motivation. And there are a number of different ways that you can craft interventions that are going to lead to success, as opposed to sort of building roadblocks between yourself and the individual. So we want to make sure that we have enough services for the people who need them the most. We want to make sure that we focus on those areas that pose the greatest issue. And we also want to make sure that we do that in a sensible manner that makes sense to both us and the person who's going to be receiving the service. We know that we're not going to have enough of these services to go around for everyone, so we want to make sure that we're only targeting those people who pose that sort of middle to the higher end of the risk continuum. The people who are at the lower end of the risk continuum probably don't need an awful lot, and you're not likely to encounter a lot of those sorts of folks within a Circles of Support program. So, what risk do people who sexually offend pose to engage in that behavior again going forward? This is still a live question, and we're not exactly sure exactly what that is, and certainly the underreporting issue is one we have to take into consideration. We know that the vast majority of people who have sexually offended will not go on to engage in a new sexual offense post-release from prison, or once they get their sanction, for those people who go straight to some sort of parole or probation or that sort of thing. The time period over which people are at risk to engage in new sexually offensive conduct is also not entirely known, although we know that the longer someone is in the community without engaging in new sexually offensive behavior, the more likely it is that they'll continue to be in the community without engaging in new sexually offensive behavior. We also know that at a certain point, even people who used to be considered to be at high risk may be not quite so high risk anymore. And this would appear to be somewhere in the 10-year range, sort of heading up to 15 years. There are some questions also as to how people should be held accountable. And this will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but most of the Western world, and certainly here in the United States and in other countries like Canada, and certainly England and Wales and Scotland and all those folks over in the UK, typically people who engage in sexually offensive conduct who are caught typically get some sort of a sentence, whether it's probation or whether they actually get sent to prison. So that's the first part of holding them accountable for their behavior, but that's probably not going to be good enough in the long run. We probably also want to see them making some changes in their life going forward, and greater accountability than simply going to prison. We want them to learn about why they engage in the behavior, and also to learn how to not engage in the behavior going forward. And this speaks to what sort of supports do they require? Are there programs that they can attend? Do they need to be in a formal sex offender treatment program of some sort like that? These are all important considerations. Over the last 30 years or so, the rates of sexual offending and sexual reoffending have been on a pretty steady decline. Part of the reason for this is that we've learned how to manage the risk in a much better way. We have new ways of actually assessing risk, and we have new ways of intervening with our clients to help them to learn what they need to learn so that they don't go back to the community and engage in more sexual violence. Probably the greatest gains in these areas have been made in the last 15 to 20 years. Certainly with respect to the advent of what we call actuarial risk assessment instruments, like for instance a tool known as the Static 99R, which is one of these actuarial tools. The other part of it is that we've done an awful lot of work in trying to determine how best to offer best practice treatment options to people who have engaged in this sort of behavior, in the hope that if they learn what they need to learn in treatment, that they won't go back to the community and engage in more sexual violence. If we look at the Static 99R, for instance, once upon a time it used to be known as just the Static 99. The R means that it was revised, and it got the R in 2009. So between 1999 and 2009, something very interesting happened. We noticed that rates of sexual reoffending decreased for some offenders by as much as a third to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 33 to 40%. The interesting thing is that this applies mostly to those people who are at the higher end of the risk continuum. The argument that I would make is that in using tools like the Static 99, which helps us to determine the level of risk that someone poses, if we can reliably determine what level of risk they pose, then we can appropriately target the higher risk offenders, and if we do so, that will decrease their rates of reoffending, and that's exactly what we've seen. So rates of reoffending between 1999 and 2009 for people at the higher end of the risk continuum dropped by about a third, between 33 and 40%. And I think this is largely attributable, or at least somewhat attributable, to the fact that we were better able to identify people who were at the higher end of that risk continuum so that we could appropriately intervene in keeping with the risk principle of the risk-need responsivity model. Okay, so when we're looking at indicators of risk, we have two general categories. We have what we call static indicators, and then we have what we call dynamic indicators. Those indicators that are static in nature means that they're things that can't change, things that are part of the individual's history, things that we have no influence over. When we talk about those dynamic sorts of variables, these are things that can change and are often things that we target with respect to supervision or perhaps treatment. We're going to start by talking about those static indicators. So, as I said, on the whole, they don't change. They're helpful for us, though, in terms of being able to gauge the long-term risk for sexual reoffending. They also, in keeping with the risk principle, help us to identify what the appropriate level of intervention would be so that the individual gets what they need. And this would be in terms of both treatment and also risk management. The first variable we're going to talk about is age. It's well known that crime is generally more of a problem in youth. That's not to say that there aren't older people who also engage in bad behaviors or in crime, but by and large they tend to be less frequent than people who are younger. And it's certainly true to say that there are more people who get in trouble with the law in their 20s than there are people who get in trouble with the law in their 50s or 60s. This applies to sexual offenders as much as it does to any other type of offender. And we know that, as they get older, people who have engaged in sexually offensive conduct are less likely to engage in new sexually offensive conduct as they age. So, to put it more simply, people who are in their 20s are much more likely to reoffend than are people in their 40s or people in their 60s. There's a sometimes held view that, and this concept we're talking about here is really age-related desistance. So it's desistance, or the stopping of engaging in a behavior as it pertains to age. And we know that there's a pretty steep slope for people who engage in crime for that to decline with age. And this applies to sexual offenders as much as anybody else. Of course, there are some people who are going to retain their risk, much later in life, but they tend to be quite rare. Over the last 33 years that I've been doing this, I've worked with maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people who have engaged in this type of behavior, and I think I can think of about maybe 5, maybe 6 clients who were post-60 who retained a high degree of risk. And that, who knows what the reason is for that, but they're quite rare. So everybody who's worked in the sexual violence prevention field for a long time can remember at least 1, 2, or maybe 5 or 6 people who were elderly and who were still quite sexually preoccupied or at high risk to engage in new sexually offensive conduct, but they would be rare by comparison to other people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Part of the reason for the effect of aging on risk has to do with that same hormone I talked about before that made sexual behavior difficulties more of a problem for people in youth, and that's the male sex hormone testosterone. So as males get older, their testosterone levels decrease. As their testosterone levels decrease, it has effects on us in terms of both how much we think about sex and how much we want to engage in sex and how well we can engage in sex. So it affects both the thought processes, the whole sort of cognitive element of things, how often we have urges or fantasies, and it also affects how well we can function. And certainly, pills like, for instance, Viagra are intended to replace function in people who still want to have sex, but whose bodies are not necessarily playing along. So, as testosterone decreases, so does risk for engagement in new sexually offensive conduct. And we know that this happens for all males, although the slope of the decrease of testosterone in the bloodstream might be slightly different for some people, but kind of across the board, we all slow down when it comes to sexual energy as we age. It's an unfortunate reality that we cannot escape. But as I said, there are some people who continue to sexually offend or who continue to be sexually preoccupied even into their sort of elderly years. And this is rare, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on. So if you had someone who was in his 60s but who was still engaging in an awful lot of sex talk, or who was going to kind of strip bars, or spending a lot of time looking at pornography. These might be indicators that the amount of age-related desistance he's experiencing might be somewhat less than that of his peers. Okay, so age is an important factor to consider. The older someone is, the less likely they are to reoffend. The second construct I want to talk about is the ability to form long-lasting intimate relationships. So, it's certainly true that some people who are in long-term intimate relationships with age-appropriate partners do engage in some sort of sexual offending. Some of them engage in new sexual offending after they've already been identified and held accountable for the earlier behavior. But on a statistical basis, people who can demonstrate the capacity to find a mate, live with that person in a sexually intimate relationship for a period of 2 years or longer, that those people are at statistically less risk to sexually reoffend than are people who haven't been able to demonstrate that. So if the person that you're working with, if your core member has been in a long-term relationship with someone in the past, that's a good thing. If they haven't been able to do that in the past, then that's a potential source of risk. The next construct I want to talk about is non-sexual violence. So it's safe to say that all sexual offenses are inherently violent, but the actual degree of violence can differ from person to person. And we know that for the vast majority of people who engage in any kind of sexually violent acts, that the amount of violence that they use is often no more than the amount of violence that's required to ensure the compliance of the victim. So there might be some threats, some restraint, but typically there wouldn't be anything that would lead to kind of egregious physical harm. There might be some physical harm that occurs, but that's not the intent. The intent is to engage in the sexual conduct. The force or the level of actual coercion is often only the amount that's required to ensure the compliance of the victim. However, there are some individuals, when you look at their offense histories, where the amount of violence that they engage in is well above what would have been required to ensure the compliance of the victim. We see people who are choked, people who are strangled, people who are cut, people who are burned, where there are other sorts of sort of over-the-top violence that's clearly not what would be required to ensure the compliance of the person who's actually being victimized. And this causes us to wonder whether or not the violence itself is part of what's maintaining the person who's engaging in the violences, their level of sexual arousal. Is it the violence that's causing them to be sexually aroused? We know that if this is true, that this is a pretty serious indicator of increased victim harm, and we know that in some of these cases, victims are harmed to the point where it causes some sort of disfigurement. Some victims are actually killed in the process, or sustain other long-term harms, not just in a psychological sense, but also in a physical sense. We suspect that in those cases where people engage in really egregious levels of violence along with the sexual violence, that maybe this might be a marker for what we call for a disorder that we call sexual sadism disorder. And in sexual sadism disorder, the individual is actually aroused by the harm that he's inflicting on the individual who is his victim. The more harm he inflicts, the more sexually aroused he is, the more satisfying the experience, but as I've said, clearly this is this is an indicator of the level of potential harm that victimized person is going to sustain. The next point that I want to talk about is how many times has the individual that you're working with, if you're in a circle of support, that'll be the person who is your core member, how often has he done it in the past? So there's an old adage, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. And we want to take that into consideration here. So certainly, the more often somebody engages in a certain type of behavior, the more likely it is that they enjoy that behavior and that somehow it's something that they want to do. People who have engaged in only one sexual offense, there's not an awful lot we can say about them other than the fact that they've engaged in one sexual offense. Someone who's engaged in a sexually offensive act, got caught, got punished, went to treatment perhaps, and then went back to the community and engaged in a new sexually offensive act, that's a different story, right? And we certainly need to consider whether or not there's some sort of persistence going on here. The more often that somebody engages in new sexually offensive conduct after they've been caught and held basically accountable for that behavior, the more often it happens, the more likely it is that there's something driving that behavior. Sometimes this is what we call, what psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers would call a paraphilic disorder. And a paraphilic disorder is a psychiatric condition that is marked by intense, recurrent sexual fantasies, thoughts, urges, and behaviors that are quite odd, perhaps, or that are quite intense, and that involve some degree of non-compliance on the part of the people who are in that sort of victim role. These are the ilias and isms, and most people have heard of some of them. So we're talking here about exhibitionism, we're talking about voyeurism, sexual sadism, pedophilia, fetishism, things along those lines. Those are the so-called paraphilias, and people who have a paraphilia are sort of typically at much greater risk to engage in new sexually offensive conduct because it's part and parcel of what they really like to do. So the issue would be, I suppose, you have someone who has exposed themselves on only one occasion. As I said, you can't really say much about that. Someone who's engaged in that same behavior on 3 or 4 or 5 occasions, there's something about what they're engaging in that's really causing a lot of kind of sexual arousal or sexual excitement. There's something about it that's causing them to continue to engage in that behavior. And the more often that you engage in something of that sort, as I said, the more likely it is that there's something about that behavior that you really like. When we look at the research, what we find is that people who have these sexually deviant interests, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get further into this, video. But the more that someone has engaged in a certain type of behavior, the more likely it is that poses, an actual, kind of deviant sexual interest for them. And when we look at the research, this is one of the more robust predictors of whether or not somebody will engage in new sexually offensive conduct going forward. There are 2 overarching risk factors that are involved in this. So people who have engaged in sexually offensive conduct, there are 2 overarching risk factors. The first is the degree to which they have deviant sexual interests, as we were just talking about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other is the degree to which they are antisocial. And when we talk about antisocial, we're not talking about people who are just not fun to be around. We're talking about people who tend to have a real difficult time following the rules of life. They tend to do what they want, kind of regardless of what that might mean for others. They tend to be very anti-establishment, anti-authority. They tend to get in trouble a lot. They're often folks who are going to break the law, that sort of thing. So where you have people who have these two overarching risk factors and strength, that being people who are both sexually deviant and quite antisocial, these are the people who pose the greatest degree of risk for us, obviously, because they're people who are sexually interested in things that are potentially harmful for others, first and foremost, and they don't have the same degree of conscience, or they don't have the same belief in the social controls that would stop them from engaging in those behaviors that place others at risk for harm. So the people who are really, really antisocial and really, really sexually deviant are the folks that we read about in books or see in movies. These would be the sort of John Wayne Gacy's and the Ted Bundys of the world, the people who are really quite dangerous. So we know that the more that somebody has been involved with the law over their life, the more likely it is that they have this sort of antisocial presentation. So one of the things we need to look at is that issue with respect to how persistent are they in their involvement in crime. How often do they get caught engaging in bad behavior, yet go back out into the community and engage in more bad behavior? One of the realities of working in a CoSA project is that you will tend to have, as your core members, people who will have some degree of that sort of core antisociality, and also some degree of the deviant sexual interest. Because in CoSA we tend to target people who are higher on that overall risk continuum, we tend to get people who have both the antisociality and the deviance issue in some strength. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the types of behaviors that people engage in. So generally there are a number of different things that people do that could be considered to be kind of sexually offensive. Certainly, I suppose one of the difficulties we have is that we haven't quite nailed this down. So it depends on where you are. It depends on what you do. Some places will take certain things more seriously than others. Certainly depending on the social, on the social constructions of that culture or of that nation, or people who have those sorts of beliefs. When we look at offending, there are contact offenses and there are non-contact offenses. And what we mean by this are those offenses where there's physical contact. So child molestation, rape, those sorts of things. And then there are types of offenses where there's no actual physical contact between the offender and the person who is the victim. There's certainly offensive sexual conduct, but no contact. So exposing, peeping in windows, kind of downloading child pornography, those are all things that would be considered to be non-contact sexual offenses. An interesting thing about them is that in comparison to the contact offenses, they seem to be the sort of behaviors that occur in a much higher density. And in fact, some of the tools that we use in our business refer to behaviors like exposing or peeping or downloading kind of inappropriate images off the internet as high density offense patterns. And they tend to be pretty highly correlated with having those so-called paraphilic interests. So it's uncommon for someone to just sort of randomly expose themselves to a stranger. Certainly some of us in college may have engaged in mooning or some other thing like perhaps maybe streaking. I'm showing my age perhaps, but it would be unusual for any of us to spend a lot of time just sort of randomly walking up to people on the street and exposing our penis to them. At the same time, most people who, most people haven't spent a significant amount of time in their life trying to peep in the windows of strangers, perhaps wanting to catch them in some stage of undress or engaging in, some other sort of, sexually explicit, sort of behavior. People who do that typically are doing that because it's what they're really interested in, and that would be one of those so-called paraphilic interests that we talked about before. So, because they have such a high correlation with those sexually deviant interests, non-contact sex offenses, wherever you find them in the history of the people that you're working with, this is a marker of some perhaps increased risk. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the types of people that people who offend might target and what that means for us in terms of risk. So the first thing to say is that 90% or more of people who are sexually offended know the person who's doing that to them. So this idea that we're at risk from strangers, is not quite as serious as we might think it is. And I'm certainly not going to advocate that parents not talk to their children about stranger danger and all of that sort of stuff, but also keep in mind that they're much more likely to be sexually abused by people they know, or in fact people who are actually members of their family. So when we look at the numbers, as I said, about 90% of people know the person who sexually offends them, and about 2/3 of all sexual offenses occur in the victim's own home, usually perpetrated by a member of their family. So there are a few things that we can say about the victim types that certain people choose in terms of their risk to reoffend. People who offend against unrelated victims, people who are not members of their core family unit, tend to be at higher risk to sexually reoffend than those people who only select victims from within family contexts. Now, certainly this is not to say that there aren't people who sexually offend within families, and we know that that's true. And we're not talking so much here about sexual offending in the first place, we're talking about sexual reoffending. So, although there are quite a number of people who sexually offend within a family context, most of them are less likely to sexually reoffend than are people who select victims outside of their family. The same is true with respect to strangers, and I talked a bit about this already, but we know that about 90% or more of people who are sexually offended by someone they know, either a friend or a family member or a colleague from work or somebody that they, it's somebody that they know. It's not a stranger who just sort of grabs them off the street. And in fact, those people who tend to grab people off the street at random tend to be the ones who, again, are much more likely to have one of those paraphilias that we talked about before, and they also tend to be much more antisocial. They're the sort of people who are reasonably rare. We can be thankful about that, but at the same time, their risk tends to be higher individually, and the amount of actual victim harm usually tends to be quite high as well. And it's these guys that who are likely to target strangers who are the ones who pose the greatest risk for that kind of egregious non-sexual violence that we talked about before. So I mean, certainly the Ted Bundys of the world, the John Wayne Gacy's, the kind of Jeffrey Dahmers, those sorts of folks. Those would be the people who, for the most part, were targeting strangers and who engaged in some unspeakable acts with their victims while they were offending. So people who select victims who they don't know or who they don't have any previous social engagement with, they tend to be at considerably higher risk than are people who only engage in sexually offensive conduct with people that they know, either from work or or because they're part of a certain social circle, something along those lines. The last victim aspect that we're going to talk about here are males. So we're not entirely sure why this is so, but it seems that whenever there is at least one male victim of a sexual offense in your core member's history, that this is a pretty strong marker of risk for future engagement in more sexually offensive conduct. That's not to say that they're absolutely going to, but when we look at it in terms of the numbers, those people who have at least one male victim of a sexual offense in their history tend to be at higher risk to engage in new sexually offensive conduct going forward. And I should remind folks that we're only talking about males here. These risk factors would not apply to female sex offenders. Okay, so those are, for the most part, the static factors that we're going to talk about. Now we're going to talk about some of the more stable indicators. So things that are not static, they're not part of the person's history, but they're things that can change, but they're unlikely to change in the short term. So these are things that we would consider to be dynamic, but as I said, they're not the sort of things that are going to change overnight. They're going to require some level of intervention, and that's where circle volunteers can really help to have some sort of impact in helping the core member to make changes. The first thing we're going to talk about is significant social influences. So think about yourselves. Think back when you were a kid. Most of us probably had at least one person that we really liked, that we had a lot of fun being with, that our mom or our dad said, "I don't want you hanging around with Joe Smith. Joe Smith is a bad influence." And you were kind of prohibited from hanging around with Joe Smith. If there's anybody out there who doesn't remember their mom or dad telling them not to hang out with someone who was a bad influence, you might consider that perhaps the other parents were talking about you. But it's true to say that we tend to, to use a kind of stats term for this, we tend to regress towards the mean, meaning that we tend to behave in keeping with the ways of the crowd. So that, sort of mob mentality, I guess, is what some people refer to it as. If you are an introvert and you're in a room full of extroverts, you'll either probably freak out and leave, or maybe you'll break out of your shell a little bit and be a bit more animated than you normally would be. If the converse were true, so you're an extrovert in a room full of people who are much more introverted than you, either you will tone it down or you'll leave in search of a better party. We tend to behave like the people around us. When we look at the larger criminological literature, we know that there are certain predictors of re-engagement in crime in people who have been involved in crime before. Andrews and Bonta from Canada had 4 factors they called the Big Four: antisocial personality, antisocial values and attitudes, antisocial behavior, and antisocial peer affiliations. And it's those antisocial peer affiliations that we're talking about here. So the more that you hang out with people who are okay with being involved in crime and who have been involved in crime, the more likely it is that you may find yourself also being involved in crime. So for our core members who have tended in the past to have friends or perhaps even family members who are sort of okay with being involved in crime, this is not such a good thing for them. It's actually part of the reason why we want them to be in a circle, because being in a circle means that they're going to be spending a lot of their time with people who are more pro-socially oriented and who are going to help them make better choices as they go forward in life. And this is an important thing. We want our core members to be surrounded by law-abiding, pro-social individuals who are going to pull them back from the edge of the cliff when they get too close. So having people who are going to help you to stay true to your path, people who are going to remind you when you start to engage in behaviors that are, maybe precursor to the sorts of things that you did when you were offending. Those are all the sorts of things that we expect pro-social individuals to do. Antisocial individuals will cause our core members to test limits, to engage in behaviors that are, ultimately probably not very good for them. We're going to talk about a group of risk factors now that we collectively refer to as so-called intimacy deficits. And here we're going to talk about capacity for relationship stability, emotional identification with children, hostility towards women, social rejection and loneliness, and lack of concern for others. And these all relate more or less to how the individual, or in this, if you're watching this video in conjunction with a Circles project, how your core members engage with others. So the first one we're going to talk about, and this is kind of similar to what we talked about in that static risk factor. Has your core member ever been in a long-term intimate relationship with an age-appropriate partner? So if he's ever been able to do that, that would be the sort of history type variable, that sort of static variable. Here we're going to talk about it in a much more dynamic sense. So the first thing that we want to know is, has he ever been able to do this? So that would be the first part. The second part, however, speaks to what's he doing now? Is he in a long-term or a reasonably longish-term relationship with someone now? Something that's stable, something that doesn't have obvious signs of problems. The sort of relationship that you expect will last, or that will have some sort of risk-reducing influence on him. So if he has someone that he's, let's say for instance, in the past he had a long-term relationship with someone for 3 or 4 years, but he hasn't got anybody now. Certainly it's possible for him to have a long-term relationship because he's demonstrated that in the past, but he doesn't enjoy the risk-reducing aspects of having a current relationship because he doesn't have anybody now. You could also think of it this way. Someone who doesn't have a history of being involved in a long-term intimate relationship with an age-appropriate partner, but who has someone that he's been living with now for 4 or 5 or 6 months. They seem to get along really well with one another, and they're not fighting all the time. You expect that this is a relationship that will last. He may not have that history of the long-term relationship in the past, but he's building that history now. So that would be something that would be good as well. The people who tend to be at the higher end of the risk continuum on this particular variable are those people who have never had a long-term relationship with an intimate partner who's age appropriate, all that sort of stuff, and they don't have it now either. Okay? There are some people who have sexually offended against children who have a certain quality about them that's childlike. They tend to be immature. They tend to have child-centered interests. Sometimes they're really quite transparent about it, and they'll say, well, I'm just a big kid myself. These are the sort of folks who would rather spend time playing with children than socializing with adults. And at times they have a real difficult time with adults in that they don't have the sort of social skills that are required to do well in adult-oriented relationships. They tend to sort of gravitate towards children because perhaps they're less threatening, or perhaps because they have similar interests. And certainly, those of us who have worked in the field for a long time can probably think of 2 or 3 really obvious examples in the clients we've seen over time, where they were just very, very interested in children, had sort of child-centered interests, and tended to be, kind of socially inept around adults, but seemed to gravitate towards children. This, as you might expect for people who have a history of sexually offending against children, is a potential risk factor, because it means that they're going to perhaps gravitate towards children and be more comfortable around children than they are around adults. So certainly this is something that we would, want to take into consideration. Now, I want to draw a distinction between people who have this emotional identification with children and people who are emotionally invested in children, perhaps as parents. So it would be normal for a parent of a prepubescent child to be interested in that child and to have some emotional investment in their, in their well-being, in how they're, sort of doing in life overall. And that's not really the sort of thing we're talking about here, because in most cases, those people will retain their adult role. So think of it this way. A parent is probably quite likely to support the activities of their kids. So let's say I had a son, and that son was involved in, baseball or hockey or something. It might be quite reasonable for me to take my kid to hockey games, where he's playing, or to practices or other things, that are involved in that process, and then be either, I might help with the coaching, or I might just be a spectator and cheer during the games, or be that sort of thing. I'm emotionally invested in my child's performance and in them, having a good time and, all that sort of stuff that parents do. That's different than the emotionally identified guy who doesn't want to sit in the stands. He wants to be on the playing field with the other kids, playing with them, because that's where he feels most comfortable. So the parent sits in the stands, cheers, all that sort of stuff. They're emotionally invested in their child, but they're not emotionally identified with childhood or with the child role, like the guy who would really rather not sit in the stands. He wants to be out there playing with the kids because that's where he feels most comfortable. Okay. Hostility towards women. So we know that there are many people who actually sexually offend against women, and sometimes there's an element of anger and sort of overt hostility to women involved in that. This is not always the case, but if you think about it, half of the world is female. If you're sexually interested in adults, that's a big percentage of the dating pool. If you have views about women that are fundamentally kind of stereotypical or biased or prejudiced in some way, it's going to make it difficult for you to interact in the world, in that half of the people are people you maybe don't have very much regard for. The sorts of people who have this risk factor in strength are the sort of people who are very stereotypical, when it comes to roles. They believe that women have a place, that women shouldn't be in kind of positions of power, and they often have great difficulty with being supervised by females, either in a work environment or if they are on your kind of probation, parole, something along those lines. This seems to be a problem for both people who have sexually offended against adults and children, although we would expect that it would be a more potent risk factor, or perhaps pertain more to those people who have actually sexually offended against female adults. This can sometimes be a problem in your circle if your core member is strongly opposed to the female members of the circle. You might have to rely on some of the male volunteers to help model good behavior for your core member. That includes a lot more sort of male-female reciprocity. Social rejection and loneliness. Now, this is one that pertains greatly to most of our core members. In fact, perhaps the one of the main reasons why people find themselves in a circle is that they've got nobody else to turn to. And in fact, the original circles were intended to use the volunteers as de facto family and friends for people who, by their offending behavior, had kind of lost those people in their lives. They don't have family members anymore because maybe that's who they sexually offended against. They don't have a lot of friends because, let's face it, being an identified sexual offender is not the sort of thing that's going to have a long queue of people waiting in line to try and be your friend. So certainly there would be some problems there. We know that people in life tend to be successful in line with the degree of support and friendship and guidance and feedback and all that sort of stuff that they get from people who are important for them. In my life, I've got friends and family. I have my wife, I have my kids, I have some close colleagues, all the sorts of people who would be very helpful in terms of if I was experiencing any difficulties, would be helpful in pointing me back in the right direction or giving me feedback, giving me some guidance if I'm kind of struggling with something. In fact, probably the best thing that you can do if you're experiencing a problem is share it with someone else so that they can assist you with that. For many of our core members, they don't have that available to them. They don't have the family and friends. As I said, because of their behavior, they've lost a lot of that. So through the circle, we replace that family and friendly structure, and as a consequence, we decrease the feelings of social rejection. We decrease the loneliness, and we help them to feel better about themselves. And as a natural as a natural consequence, they tend to reoffend less often. There's a sort of simple truth that I guess that I've noticed in my work with circles over the years. People who have people who care about them tend to care more about themselves and, by extension, others. If you have nobody else in the world who cares about you, it's really easy not to care about others as well. And when you're kind of trying to decide whether or not you're going to engage in a certain sort of behavior, not caring about others, I think, really doesn't stop you from doing it, right? If you think to yourself, well, maybe somebody might be hurt by this, or maybe this will hurt the people who are my volunteers, or it will disappoint them. Those are the sorts of things that might cause them to think about doing something else. Lack of concern for others sort of dovetails with what we were talking about before. So there are some people in life who are quite antisocial and who are kind of quite disinterested in the consequences that their behaviors might have for others. Those folks tend to be quite narcissistic. They tend to be quite selfish. They engage in behaviors simply because they want to, and it really doesn't matter what happens to others as a consequence. They tend to lack empathy. They tend to have a really difficult time understanding that what they've done has been harmful to others, or in fact, at times they don't even care to understand. They just really don't, it doesn't matter to them what happens to others. They want to do something, they do it, and it doesn't matter what happens to others as a consequence of that. Sometimes we refer to these people as being sociopaths. You might have heard that term before, or perhaps you might have heard the term psychopathy. And certainly people who have that kind of psychopathic personality tend to engage in a lot of antisocial behavior. They tend to be at times quite violent, and often they don't really care about what happens to others as they engage in the behaviors that they choose to. You may find that initially in some of your core members, they may tend to have this highly narcissistic and highly selfish kind of personality orientation. And that's because we do tend to select people who are at the higher ends of the risk and deviance continuums, or it should be, I guess, the risk and deviance continua, if I'm going to be proper. And these folks are the ones we more often tend to get in our circles. One of the things you'll notice as you continue to volunteer, though, is that involvement in the circle can have, at times, a pretty dramatic effect on their personality orientation and how much they take into consideration what their actions mean for others. And I think this goes back to what I talked about before, which is that idea that people who care about them tend to care more about themselves and, by extension, others. So once they get that you're going to be with them, that you're going to do things with them, that you're going to give them advice, that you're going to care about them, this may be a rather unique experience for them, at least in the recent past. And as a consequence of you sticking by them, they may start to change in their orientation and become a little less narcissistic and a little less selfish. Okay, the next group of factors we're going to talk about are referred to as general self-regulation. And basically, this is how well do they conduct themselves as people. And here we're going to talk about impulsive acts, poor cognitive problem-solving skills, and negative emotionality and hostility. People who are impulsive are pretty easy to spot. They're the kind of folks that don't really even get to the problem-solving stage. They're kind of like stimulus response. They live their lives like pinballs, bouncing from bumper to bumper without necessarily knowing where they're going to end up next. And this can be quite problematic if you think about it. I mean, how well would you lead your life if you didn't plan anything, if you just sort of went with the flow all the time? You sort of walk in a room and do the first thing that comes to mind. How successful do you think you would be? These sorts of folks who are kind of impulsive, they don't really have a life plan, that they don't really think about what it is that they're doing. They sort of, as I said, they're like a pinball, bouncing from bumper to bumper. They're easily swayed by kind of opportunistic circumstances. They often engage in behaviors with a high likelihood of poor outcomes or negative consequences. They tend to be easily bored. They're thrill seekers, and they may often fail to consider the personal safety aspects, both for themselves and for others, and this can be quite problematic. So, being in a circle will help them to learn how to engage some problem-solving skills, which is the factor we're going to talk about next. So if we think of people who are impulsive as those people who don't really get to the problem-solving stage, they're just sort of stimulus response, there can also be problems when people get to the problem-solving stage if they're not particularly good problem solvers. To be a good problem solver, you have to be able to do three things. The first thing is you have to be able to identify that there actually is a problem. And many people who engage in sexually offensive conduct have a difficult time coming to terms with what it is that they did and what it meant for others. And you often hear a lot of denial. You often hear a lot of minimization. You hear a lot of victim blaming, or people not taking responsibility for their actions. Now, the scientific literature would tell us that those are not particularly important risk factors. Whether or not somebody admits to their crime doesn't really mean that they're at higher risk to engage in new crimes. But they are important life skills, right? Nobody wants to be around someone who never takes responsibility for their actions. Nobody wants to be around that guy who always says it wasn't me, or the guy who seems not to understand that what he did caused harm or caused other people to experience difficulties. So we certainly want to look at that sort of thing. And from the sort of problem solving standpoint, this first element of being a decent problem solver is being able to actually look at your circumstances and say, something I did got me here. So that's the first bit. The second part is that you have to be able to come up with alternative behaviors that are intended to replace whatever that problematic behavior was. So you sort of look at yourself and say, okay, the last time I did it, I did A, and A turned out bad. Let's try B this time and see what happens. Okay? So being able to generate alternative behaviors that are intended to help you avoid engaging in the same bad behavior, that's the second step. And that can be problematic too, because even though you're able to come up with alternatives, who says B is any better than A, right? So you have the first problem perhaps in not being able to identify that you have a problem at all. Once you identify that you have that problem, you have to come up with a reasonable way of doing it in the future that's actually going to fix the problem. So just because you can come up with some sort of alternative behavior doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be better for you or for anyone else for that matter. And that's where you need the third part. The third part of being a good problem solver is having the capacity to step back, take a look at what you did that was the new behavior, and decide whether or not that actually got you closer to what you were originally trying to do. So did B end up better than A, or is B just as bad? So that's the three things. The first thing, being able to identify that there is a problem in the first place. And sometimes that can be really, really difficult for our core members, because intrinsically most of them know that the sexually offensive conduct that they engaged in is not something to be proud of. So they have a lot of shame and embarrassment, and sometimes that can cause them to not want to take responsibility for their actions. So that's the part that gets in the way of the problem identification. So that's the first part. Second part is coming up with new ways of doing things. So if the last time that you tried to meet your sexual intimacy needs, you forced someone, the next time you wouldn't force someone, right? That would be the new behavior, and that certainly isn't going to get you in trouble with the law. You may not be entirely successful in being able to meet your sexual needs, but if you continue to do it in that fashion, ultimately you're going to meet someone who's going to want to be with you and want to spend time with you, because you take into consideration their wants and needs as well. So being able to come up with new behaviors that are going to be more healthy as you try to achieve whatever life goal it is you're trying to achieve, that's the second part. The third part is that capacity to step back, look at what happened when you use the new behavior, and determine whether or not that's better, the same, or worse than what you did in the first place. Negative emotionality and hostility. So, one of the things you'll notice about some of your core members is that they're what we call institutionalized, or because of their long involvement with the legal system, they've sort of taken on a kind of personality that causes them to be more negatively focused and more unreasonably hostile than perhaps others. The sort of folks that we're talking about here, these are not the folks who are just sad or unhappy. We're talking about the kind of folks who have a chip on their shoulder. The sort of guy that you would say, good day to, and he'd say, what's good about it? Or you said, sky's blue. No, it isn't. Water's wet. No, it isn't. The sort of person who it's almost like it would kill them to actually agree with you on anything. Or the folks who are always, sort of prone to negative sorts of views about things, like I'll never get ahead in life. Life cards are stacked against me. I'm never going to be able to do this, that, or the other thing. Those people who are sort of chronically negative. And sometimes this can actually turn into a bit of paranoia, and it might seem almost a little bit psychotic, like they're sort of losing touch with reality. Sometimes it also bleeds into overt hostility. So it's not just that they're sort of negative with you and that they're always seeing the glass as half empty, but they also may be more inclined to be sort of overtly combative with you, whether that's verbally or at times, unfortunately, physically. So it's the sort of thing to be mindful of. If you have a core member who tends to be quite negative, you may want to gently try to help them see the other side of the coin. You certainly don't want to get yourself into a situation where you're getting into a heated argument that may turn into something that is ultimately not going to be good for either one of you. Okay. The next section we're going to talk about is sexual self-regulation. And here we're going to talk about sex drive and sexual preoccupations, sex as coping, and what we call deviant sexual interest. And I talked a bit about this before, and I just want to remind you that when we look at the risk assessment literature, the single greatest predictor that any known sexual offender will engage in new sexually offensive conduct is whether or not they have some deviant sexual interest. And we'll talk a bit more about them here. There will also be another training session like this one that will be specifically oriented towards talking about sexual deviance. So you might want to look for that as well. First item here, sex drive and sex preoccupations. So we know that people tend to have different sexual appetites. Some people are more sexually interested than others. There are some people who would like to have sex quite often, maybe even daily, whereas others are happy with engaging in sexual conduct on a much less frequent basis. As I talked about before, this tends to be related to age, with people who are younger being more sexually interested than people who are older. And when we look at the group of people who have engaged in sexual offending, we can see a difference in the frequency with which people engage in that sexually offensive conduct as well. When we were talking about the static variables, when we talked about the non-contact sexual offenses, I said that the people who engage in non-contact offenses were much more likely to engage in high-density behavior, meaning that they engage in it quite frequently. So just by comparison, think of it this way. Someone who engages in rape behavior may not do that at a particularly high frequency. They may have 6, 7, or maybe even 10 or 12 victims. Whereas someone who is an exhibitionist could literally expose to 10 or 12 different people before lunch, right? So it's a much more high density behavior, happens much more frequently, and it's probably being driven by some element of a higher sex drive or by some sort of a sexual preoccupation. So people who engage in an awful lot of sex, or who are very sexually fixated and who have histories of engaging in some sort of sexual violence, we know that this is a risk factor because the more often that they're engaging in sex, the more likely it is that they might fall into old ways of doing things. So we're not so much here making a comment on how often people should or should not engage in sexual activities. I think what we're trying to get at here is that people who are thoughtful about what they do tend to get in less trouble. So people who are highly sexually preoccupied are the sort of people who are having multiple partners. That they tend to masturbate a lot. They may use kind of prostitutes, spend a lot of time going to strip clubs or perhaps massage parlors, a lot of phone sex, a lot of downloading or surfing the internet for pornography. They may even have a large pornography collection. And this is often because once they've masturbated to a certain model, it's almost like a been there, done that, and they're interested in that novel stimulus. They want something new. And it's that drive for something new that causes them to have high numbers of sexual partners, lots of engagement with sort of casual sexuality, impersonal sexuality, and this bleeds over into their conversations or into ways that they do things kind of socially. People who are highly sexually preoccupied are often pretty obvious in it. And if you have this in someone who has a history of engaging in sexually offensive conduct, you can see how this would be a risk factor. The more indiscriminate the sexuality, the more likely it is that they may engage in some indiscriminate sexuality that gets them into trouble with the law. Sex is coping. So when you have a bad day, what do you do to pull yourself out of it? So there are lots of different ways that we deal with stress. Some people might have a glass of wine, or a cocktail, something along those lines. So, some people might go for a walk with a friend or with their partner. Other people may exercise. Some people like to go on Amazon and shop. Other people may engage in other sorts of behaviors, but things that are intended to make us feel better or at least help us feel a little less bad about whatever it was that happened that caused us to be stressed out. Sometimes sex is a very reasonable way to deal with stress. Sometimes, if you've had a really bad day, maybe the best thing for you is just to, spend some time with your honey. It's not a bad thing. Unless that's the only way you ever deal with stress, right? If you're kind of a one-trick pony, had a bad day at work, gotta have sex. Got stuck in traffic, gotta masturbate. Didn't get my raise or didn't get, my new job, gotta go see a prostitute. If the way that you deal with stress is almost routinely through engagement in, sexual behavior, probably not a good thing, especially if you have a history of engaging in inappropriate sexuality. The more likely it is that you're going to sort of default to sex as a way to deal with stress. Let's face it, people don't typically make good decisions when they're stressed out or when they're feeling badly about things. And in fact, in a circle, if your core member had a bad day or a fight with his boss or didn't get the raise or that sort of thing, we want them to call you, basically, or get together with the circle and talk that through. Engaging in masturbation or casual or impersonal sex as a way to deal with that stress is ultimately not helpful for them or healthy for them, and may lead them back into old ways of behaving that might get them in trouble, and as a consequence might harm others. Okay, the big issue here, deviant sexual interests. So when we look at the scientific literature, and I've said this a few times, and I'm saying it because it's important, people who have deviant sexual interests are more likely to sexually reoffend than are people who don't have deviant sexual interests. Now, it's important to note that most people who engage in sexual offending are not doing so because they are fundamentally sexually deviant. And once again, there's a training video on the nature of sexual deviance that I would encourage you to watch as well. Deviant interests are sometimes difficult to assess because the behaviors themselves often look very similar to the sorts of behaviors that non-deviant people are engaging in. Or sometimes the reason for offending isn't so much about sexual deviance as it is about antisociality. An example here would be rape. So there's been a lot said about rape. Clearly, this is a sexually offensive act. But the reasons why people engage in that behavior can be quite different. So take, for instance, these two individuals. The first guy, he's in his mid-20s. He's been dating the same girl for the last month. They seem to have been having a good time with one another. Their relationship is not sexual as yet, although he certainly anticipates that and is hoping for that. So on a Friday evening, they go out, they have dinner, they go to a movie. At the end of the night, he drives her home and she invites him upstairs. Says, you want to come up for a coffee or a glass of wine, whatever the case may be. He says, fine. So they actually go upstairs, they have the glass of wine, they engage in some kissing, maybe a bit of fondling, or, as we used to call it, kind of heavy petting. But when it comes to that point where he wants to take it to the next level and she doesn't, she says no, and he doesn't take no for an answer. So he essentially forces himself on her, and she's raped. Take the second guy. The second guy is on a bus. He's also in his mid-20s. And while he's sitting on the bus, and let's say it's early evening, while he's sitting on the bus, he notices, a fairly attractive woman sitting a few rows up from him. She gets up to leave. So, she either pushes the button, pulls the string, or whatever it is that signals the bus driver she wants to get off. And when she gets off, he gets off and follows her. And, they're sort of walking along the sidewalk, and as she walks by a clump of, bushes, he grabs her, hits her about the head a few times, forces her to the ground, holds his hand over her mouth, and says, "If you scream, I'll kill you." He rips her clothes off, and he forces himself on her, and she is ultimately raped. In both of these scenarios, the woman has been raped, and there's no question about that. And there are consequences that she is going to suffer. She'll probably need some sort of medical attention. She may need some counseling. For him, he has engaged in a sexual offense, and he needs to be held accountable for that. But there are differences between these two offenders, or at least there's potentially differences between these two offenders. The first guy didn't take no for an answer. Up until that point, he didn't seem to be very antisocial. He didn't seem to be a bad guy or a jerk or anything like that. But ultimately, he engaged in some pretty bad behavior. Take the second guy. He grabbed a stranger off the street, someone he'd never met before, forced that person into the bushes, beat her, threatened her with her life, and quite forcefully raped her. Both of these women have been raped, and I'm not saying anything about that. What I'm talking about is that the motivations for engaging in the behavior between these two guys, the first guy wanted to have sex with this woman and didn't take no for an answer. The second guy wanted to have sex with that woman, and whether or not she would have said yes or no wasn't of interest to him. He was going to do it regardless. And in fact, the fact that she was fighting back may have actually increased his sexual arousal, which may not have been the case for the first guy. In both cases, we have someone who's raped, but the motivation for that behavior may be different. The likelihood that the first guy has deviant sexual interest, probably reasonably low. The likelihood that the second guy has deviant sexual interest, probably much higher. So these are the sort of things that we're trying to tease out. And I guess the part that makes it difficult is that we're only looking at people who have already engaged in sexual violence, and we're trying to make some qualifications for risk assessment based on the rationale for their engaging in the behavior. Let's take another example. We've got two guys, both of whom have been sexually involved with an 8-year-old girl. The first guy is her stepfather, and over a period of time, there's been some blurred boundaries in the family. He's not getting along with her mother very well. There might be, some sexual blockage for him. And his interest in his daughter has become, or in his stepdaughter has become more sexualized over time. As he becomes more sexually frustrated, he may be also using alcohol as a means to deal with stress. So, in this situation, he finds himself engaging in sexually inappropriate conduct with that, with that 9-year-old girl, or 8-year-old. I don't remember what I said. Take the second guy. He sexually interacts with this young girl because she's the sort of person he's much more interested in. If he had access to an age-appropriate partner, he probably wouldn't be all that interested in that person, because he actually prefers the body shape of someone who is prepubescent. This is the individual we would characterize as being pedophilic, or as having a so-called pedophilic disorder, where he has a strong interest in, or perhaps even a sexual preference for, engaging in sexual behaviors with underdeveloped girls. And if he had access to an age-appropriate partner, wouldn't be as sexually arousing for him. The first guy would rather have a healthy sexual relationship with his partner, but failing that, based on a lot of other situations of stress and whatever, he finds himself using his stepdaughter almost as a surrogate. So in this instance, the first guy has certainly engaged in some inappropriate sexual conduct with his stepdaughter. The second guy, inappropriate sexual conduct with this 8 or 9-year-old girl. But the rationale for engaging in that behavior is different between the two of them, and that's the part that makes it the risk factor. Those people who would prefer, or who are more greatly interested in the sexually inappropriate conduct, to the extent that it's more arousing for them and more satisfying for them, that's where the deviant sexual interests become the risk factor. Those people who have deviant sexual interests are at higher risk to engage in more deviant sexuality than are people who have a history of engaging in sexually inappropriate conduct, but who don't have those deviant sexual interests. The way that you get some sense of this is often looking at their behavioral history. How often have they done the thing that would suggest that they have the deviant sexual interest? Being sexually involved with one child, certainly a bad thing, and we don't condone that in any way. But if the person you have in front of you has only had one child, only one child victim, he's less likely to have deviant sexual interests than say one of your other core members who's got 10 child victims, right? Sometimes your core member will also just flat out tell you. They'll say, I'm really troubled about how much I think about little boys. Or, I'd like to be able to have sex with someone without wanting to think about violence at the same time, right? So sometimes your core members, once they get to know you, once they feel a little more sort of trusting of you, they'll be more inclined to tell you about what's going on for them. The last risk factor that we're going to talk about is what we call cooperation with supervision. Now, when we use the word supervision in this context, we're not talking about simply kind of probation, parole supervision, that sort of thing. We're talking about how well do they work within the confines of whatever restrictions have been placed on them. So most of the core members that you'll work with will either be on probation, maybe parole. It's unlikely that any of them won't be on what we call a sex offender registry. Some of them may have kind of GPS bracelets or anklets of those sorts. There may be kind of all sorts of other restrictions. They may be required to meet with police on a certain frequency. They may have to go and meet with their PO. They have some responsibilities with respect to the circle. They may also be involved in some sort of a treatment program. All of those are things where there are expectations of them. And when we talk about cooperation with supervision, we're talking about the extent to which they function well within the confines of those expectations. Do they show up for treatment? Do they show up on time? Do they actually participate? Do they meet with their PO, when they're supposed to? Do they keep appointments? Do they show up for your circle meetings? Do they keep in contact with their various volunteers? These are all the sorts of things that we want them to do, because ultimately, learning to be responsible and to follow along with the rules and expectations of others is part of what will assist them in being more successful in the community this time around. Okay, so we talked about risk variables that are more static in nature. That was the first part that we talked about. So those are things that are part of a person's history, or they might answer the question, what has he done? The second grouping of risk factors that we talked about were the stable dynamic ones, where there are things that can change, but are probably going to take some time and some degree of an intervention in order for that to actually happen. The last group of risk factors that we want to talk about here are ones that are more acute. And these are actually the same risk factors that we talked about in the last section when we talked about the stable dynamic factors. But here we're talking about things that are likely to be more acutely problematic given certain circumstances that might be more time related. So, for instance, someone who's managing himself quite well, someone who has, let's say this individual has had some problems in the past with kids. And he's got a job that doesn't put him in proximity to children. He's built a lifestyle that limits the amount of access that he's going to have to children, all those sorts of things, because he knows that those are issues that he needs to manage. Let's say one morning he gets off the elevator and steps into the foyer, and the foyer is full of children. So here's a guy who's built a lifestyle that for the most part keeps him out of harm's way. But in this instance, he's now, kind of presented with a set of circumstances that he didn't anticipate, that may be somewhat problematic for him. So here's a situation that's time related, doesn't have an awful lot to do with his lifestyle overall, but it's something he's going to have to deal with in the short term. So in this instance, this is like, kind of acute access to victims, or access to people who could potentially be his victims. Some of the other things we may look at are the influence of situational variables like that stress. So overall, someone may cope with stress reasonably well, but given a set of circumstances, they may lapse into sexual behavior given circumstances. That might be something that is not their typical way of dealing with it, but on this one occasion, it's gotten them into some trouble. The same thing may be true with respect to hostility. Sometimes people who are under a lot of kind of supervisory restrictions in the community, sometimes they it gets the better of them, and they just say, "Oh my God, if you're not going to let me lead a life, just send me back to prison," or they do something silly like they blow up at their PO, or they do something else that probably poorly considered, but in the end doesn't help them in their overall goal of kind of reintegrating with the community. Sometimes they lose important people in their lives. And that's where the circle, I think, can be really important in trying to sort of offset some of those losses. Many people who have been in prison for a really, really long time don't have many people left in their social circle, and we talked about this earlier. Maybe the only two people in their life who even still care about them might be their mom or dad, or some other member of their family, and their AA sponsor, let's say. And sometimes your core members will be in their 40s or 50s, and maybe their parents are sort of elderly and maybe having some health problems. So if your guy really only has his mom left, and she's got end stage cancer, or some other problem, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinson's, whatever else may be the case, and she dies, that would be obviously something very acutely stressful for them. Something that, while they may deal with stress quite reasonably otherwise, in the moment, they might experience some higher degree of risk. This is where I think the circle can be so incredibly helpful, because when one of these sorts of acute risk kinds of scenarios occurs, this is when we want them to reach out to their volunteers. This is when they want to call, when we want them to call someone and say, "Hey, I'm having a really bad day. Can we get together for coffee? Can we go for lunch? Can we talk on the phone? Can we just meet and chat?" Something along those lines. And I think this is really the power of the circle, is that capacity to deal with things in the moment as they're happening, and to really assist your core members in being able to get back on track. So those acute risk variables are really quite similar to the stable dynamic variables, and it's more the sort of ebb and flow of risk over time, right? So they may be reasonably okay, over a year, but there may be times when certain risk factors will be more pertinent than others, and that's, I think, something to really take into consideration. And as I said, it's where the circle has the greatest capacity to intervene and to help get them back on track, or at least provide that feedback and guidance that will help them not engage in behaviors that are ultimately quite damaging. So we've talked about a lot of different risk factors here, and I think it's important to also consider that when someone is being supervised, or when they're in a sex offender treatment program, the areas where they demonstrate the greatest degree of problem is also what's going to be focused on in those interventions. And this is consistent with the need principle we talked about way back at the beginning. The need principle being, find out where the individual has problems and deal with those problems. Don't try to treat issues that the individual doesn't experience problems in, right? So if your guy's got difficulty with stress management, you need to focus on that. If he has some difficulties with alcohol and drugs, you need to focus on that. If he doesn't have difficulty with alcohol and drugs, asking him to go to AA, it might be a nice social outlet, but it's not going to assist him with the problems he actually has. So it's better to focus on the stuff that's actually problematic. So where you have people who are demonstrating problems in any of the risk factors that we talked about throughout this talk, those are the areas that you want to focus on, both in terms of kind of supervision, if you're a PO, or if you're someone who has some supervisory responsibility. It may also be good for circle volunteers to be well versed in how these risk factors impact daily functioning. And also from the perspective of an actual treatment program, the areas that that the core member is actually demonstrating some issues in, those are where those treatment professionals are going to want to focus. From the circle's perspective, you're there to support the work that he's doing in treatment, and to try to help him expand his understanding of those constructs, and to try to implement those changes in his life. And this is, of course, the sort of thing that needs to be done as a team. And certainly throughout these videos that we have, for training purposes for CoSA, we're always going to be advocating the team approach. In fact, that's what the circle is, right? It's a group of people working together towards a common goal, which is no more victims and increased functionality for our core members. We want our core members to be able to have the sorts of balanced and self-determined lifestyles that we enjoy, or at least that we seek to enjoy. And we want to work together with all of our stakeholders. If there's a PO in the picture, we want to work together with that person. If there is a treatment professional, we want to work with that person as well. And I think we really need to be mindful of the no more secrets aspect as well. That the more that we encourage our core members to engage in secret behaviors, or the more we allow them to engage in those secret behaviors, the more we potentially increase risk for them returning to bad sexual conduct. The last thing that I want to talk about is whether or not high-risk offenders are high risk forever. And I think there's a perspective out there that once a sex offender, always a sex offender, that treatment doesn't work, and that most of these fellows are sort of intractable sexual deviants who are wandering the streets looking for opportunities to engage in more sexual violence. While there's probably a small handful of those sorts of people in the world, the vast majority of people who have engaged in sexually offensive conduct aren't particularly happy about the fact that they did so, and would like to live a life that doesn't include the revolving door of in prison, out of prison, in trouble, out of trouble, all that sort of stuff. We know that depending on the level of risk that we assess, and we do that by considering the risk factors we've talked about here, that those people who are at the higher end of the risk continuum do in fact tend to sexually reoffend more often than people who are at the more moderate or at the lower end of that risk continuum. And if we look at them just as three groups over time, we can see that the differences in the rates of reoffending are really quite different. We know that if someone is going to sexually reoffend, they're likely to do so in the first 5 years after release. And in fact, about 2/3 of the new sexual offending in any of these risk groups occurs within that first 5 years. And then after that point, the slope of the curve of the reoffending starts to bottom out. It's safe to say that the longer someone who is at risk to engage in sexually offensive conduct, the longer that they are in the community without engaging in new sexually offensive conduct, the more likely it is that they'll continue to be in the community without engaging in new sexually offensive conduct. The way that they're going to be able to do that is through good post-release supervision, treatment, and through having the support of people like Circle volunteers, or family or friends or other people who are pro-social, who are going to encourage them to engage in good behavior. So if we attend to those needs, those dynamic risk factors, we can assist our core members in being more successful once they've been released back to the community. And as I've been saying, the longer they're successful, the more likely it is that they'll continue to be successful. And the research literature suggests that if even high-risk offenders can be in the community for 10 years without engaging in new sexually offensive conduct, that they all of a sudden start to look a lot more like their moderate and low-risk compatriots. And that 10 years of success in the community sort of demonstrates that they've been able to make some really important changes in their life. And those important changes in their life can't be done alone. They need to be done with some assistance from other people, and this is where I think the circle of support can be really, quite helpful. So with that, I'm going to sign off. This is the end of this particular video. I hope that it's been informative. If you have any, any further questions, you can certainly send me an email. My email address is that is on my website, which is www.robinjwilson.com, and I'm happy to respond to any queries you may have. And I'll remind you that the PowerPoint that goes along with this video can also be found at that site. Thank you.